For generations, my family had an antique rocking chair that was passed down from one generation to another. One night, as I was trying to sleep, I heard a creaking sound coming from the living room, and when I went to investigate, I saw the rocking chair moving on its own, as if someone was sitting on it. I tried to rationalize it, thinking it was the wind, but as I got closer, the chair stopped moving, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Suddenly, a voice that sounded like it was from the past whispered in my ear, saying, "You shouldn't have disturbed me." I ran out of the room terrified, and never went back there again. The next day, I found out that my great-great-grandfather had died in that chair, and my family had kept it as a reminder of him. It was a dark and stormy night, and Sarah was driving home from work. As she turned onto a deserted road, her car suddenly broke down, and she was left stranded. With no phone signal and no other cars in sight, Sarah decided to walk to the nearest house to seek help. As she walked through the rain, she noticed a figure in the distance, standing motionless in the middle of the road. As she got closer, she realized that it was a woman, and she was holding a small child. Sarah called out to her, but the woman didn't respond. When Sarah got close enough to see her face, she gasped in terror. The woman and her child were both pale, with blank eyes and mouths stitched shut.
Sophie had always been intrigued by the abandoned mansion at the outskirts of town. The rumors of a wealthy family's tragic demise inside its walls had only heightened her curiosity. So, when she stumbled upon an old key that fit the mansion's front door, she couldn't resist the temptation to explore. As she made her way through the dusty, cobweb-filled rooms, she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. And when she reached the top floor, she saw the ghostly figure of a woman in a white dress standing at the end of the hallway. Paralyzed with fear, Sophie tried to flee, but the door at the end of the hallway slammed shut. Trapped and alone, she heard the sound of approaching footsteps, growing louder and louder. And as the ghostly figure drew closer, Sophie realized too late that some secrets were better left buried in the past. For years, the old asylum on the hill had been closed and abandoned. But one day, a group of teenagers decided to sneak in to explore the building. As they made their way through the dark hallways, they could hear strange noises coming from the rooms. And then, they heard a voice whisper, "Get out before it's too late." Terrified, the teenagers turned to run back the way they came. But as they reached the entrance, they found the doors were locked. Suddenly, the lights flickered on, revealing the figure of a man standing in front of them. He was dressed in the tattered uniform of an asylum orderly, and his eyes were hollow and empty. The teenagers screamed and tried to run past him, but the man grabbed them one by one, dragging them back into the darkness of the asylum. And they knew then, with a growing sense of horror, that they were never going to leave. Emily woke up in the middle of the night to find her bedroom window wide open. She knew she had closed it before going to bed. As she sat up to investigate, she heard a low growling sound coming from outside. As she peered out the window, she saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. She tried to look away, but she was unable to break the gaze. Suddenly, the creature outside lunged forward, its twisted form filling her with terror. Emily tried to run, but her legs felt like lead. The creature pursued her relentlessly, its low growling sound echoing through the empty house. In that moment, Emily knew she would never escape the creature's grasp. It had claimed another victim, and no one would ever know the true horror of what had happened to her that night.
A young woman hears a knock on her front door. When she answers, no one is there. This happens every night for a week, until she finally decides to stay up and catch the prankster. When she hears the knock, she swings the door open to find a figure standing in the darkness. It's not a prank, it's a monster with glowing eyes and sharp teeth, ready to pounce. Megan had always been afraid of the attic, but she needed to get some old family photos for her genealogy project. She climbed up the creaky ladder, her flashlight illuminating the dark space. Suddenly, she heard footsteps, but she was the only one home. She tried to ignore the noise and focused on the photos. But as she turned to leave, she saw a figure in the corner of the room, watching her. It was a woman, with long hair and a ghostly pallor. Megan stumbled back in horror, falling off the ladder and breaking her neck. They found her body the next day, but the photos were gone, taken by the ghostly figure that haunted the attic. As Emma lay in bed, a strange noise emanated from her closet. Despite her initial reluctance, the noise grew louder and Emma was forced to investigate. Slowly, she opened the closet door to reveal a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. Startled, Emma stumbled back and tried to switch on the light. But, as she groped in the dark, she realized that her closet had no back wall and instead led to another dimension. Suddenly, the glowing eyes disappeared, and Emma was plunged into darkness. From the depths of the unknown, she heard a low growl, followed by a sound of something crawling towards her. Emma screamed as she ran out of the room, knowing that the creature was already pursuing her. She could feel its hot breath on the back of her neck as she fled down the hallway. The little girl couldn't sleep, as she felt a pair of eyes watching her from under the bed. She tried to ignore it, but the feeling grew stronger. Finally, she mustered up the courage to peek under the bed and saw a pair of glowing eyes staring back at her. She screamed and ran to her parents' room, but they told her she was just imagining things. As she lay in bed, trying to calm herself down, she heard a scratching sound coming from under the bed. Suddenly, a bony hand shot out and grabbed her ankle. The little girl screamed for her parents, but they didn't come. The hand dragged her under the bed, and the last thing she saw were the glowing eyes staring back at her. Every night, Amelia heard strange noises coming from the attic. She tried to convince herself that it was just the wind, but the noises grew louder and more persistent. Finally, she decided to investigate. As she climbed up the stairs, the hairs on the back of her neck stood up. She cautiously pushed open the door to the attic and saw a little girl sitting in the corner. The girl turned around and looked at Amelia with empty, soulless eyes. Suddenly, the little girl disappeared, and the door slammed shut. From that day on, Amelia could never shake the feeling that she was being watched. And every night, she heard the little girl's laughter echoing from the attic. Kate had always been suspicious of her new neighbor, who seemed friendly enough, but something about him made her uneasy. One day, as she walked by his house, she noticed strange symbols etched into the walls, and that night, she saw him through his window, performing a dark ritual. As he noticed her watching, he smiled and whispered, "You're next," sending a shiver down her spine. Jane had just finished watching a scary movie and was convinced she was alone in the house, but suddenly she heard a voice whisper her name. She searched every room, but found nothing out of the ordinary. As she headed back to her room, she heard a voice say, "Behind you," causing her heart to skip a beat. She turned around slowly and saw a dark figure looming over her, its eyes reflecting a sinister glint. Every night for the past week, the little girl had heard a voice whispering her name. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, but as the voice grew louder and more insistent, she began to feel a growing sense of unease. One night, she opened her eyes to see a tall, shadowy figure standing at the foot of her bed, its eyes fixed on her with an intense and unsettling gaze. The figure beckoned to her, and the little girl felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that the voice had been leading her to this moment all along. Anna had always been afraid of the closet in her childhood bedroom, convinced that there was something sinister lurking inside. As she grew older, she learned to dismiss her childhood fears, but lately she had been hearing strange noises coming from the closet that she couldn't ignore. When she finally worked up the courage to open the door, she found an old diary inside with pages written in her own handwriting, except the entries described events and experiences she had no memory of. As Anna read through the entries, she began to realize that the presence in her closet might be something far more sinister than she had ever imagined. As I walked through the abandoned hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The halls were eerily quiet, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. Suddenly, I heard a faint whisper coming from down the hall. I cautiously followed the sound, and as I turned the corner, I saw a figure standing in front of me. It was a woman, with long black hair and a pale face. She was wearing a hospital gown, and her eyes were fixated on me. I tried to turn and run, but my legs wouldn't move. As she got closer, I saw that her eyes were completely black, and she let out a blood-curdling scream. I woke up in a cold sweat, realizing it was all just a nightmare. But as I looked in the mirror, I saw a faint reflection of the woman behind me, and her voice whispered, "You can't escape." Mary always thought the creaking sounds in her attic were just old pipes. But one night, the sounds became more intense, and she couldn't ignore them any longer. As she climbed up the ladder to the attic, she saw a pair of eyes staring back at her in the darkness. She tried to run, but something grabbed her ankle, pulling her back down. As she fell, she realized she wasn't alone. There were dozens of hands reaching up from the darkness, grabbing at her. She screamed and struggled, but it was no use. The hands dragged her back into the darkness, and she was never seen again. From that day on, every night, the creaking sounds could be heard coming from the attic. And those who dared to investigate never returned. On a summer day, Rachel and her friends decided to explore an abandoned house. They encountered a little girl with black, soulless eyes who tugged at Rachel's hair. They managed to escape, but the girl's laughter echoed through the house. From that day on, Rachel's hair turned black, and whenever she looked in the mirror, she could see the girl's reflection, smiling back at her with her soulless eyes. The experience left Rachel and her friends terrified, and they never spoke of it again. As the lights flickered, Jenny felt a chill run down her spine. She heard footsteps upstairs and wondered if it was her imagination. Suddenly, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder, and a voice whispered in her ear, "I've been waiting for you." Julie was always uneasy being alone in the house, but tried to push her fears aside. One night as she got ready for bed, she noticed the steam on the mirror formed into a message that read, "You're not alone." She immediately felt a chill run down her spine and turned around to find nobody there. She tried to ignore it and went to bed, but couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching her. The next day, she found a small handprint on the foggy mirror, confirming that she wasn't alone. Alison woke up in the middle of the night and saw a figure standing at the end of her bed. She blinked, and it was gone. As she tried to shake off the feeling of unease, she noticed a piece of paper on her nightstand. It said, "I'll be back." Marie saw her reflection in the mirror start to move on its own. It turned, revealing a mouthful of razor-sharp teeth, and smiled at her. She tried to look away, but her reflection grabbed her and pulled her into the darkness beyond the mirror. Olivia walked through the old cemetery at night. She heard a voice calling her name. Startled, she turned around and saw no one. But she noticed that some of the gravestones had been moved, and a putrid smell filled the air. Suddenly, she saw a figure emerging from the darkness. She realized that it was the ghost of a young girl who had died in that very spot many years ago. The ghostly figure extended her hand towards Olivia, and with a pleading voice, she asked for her help to finally rest in peace. As Zoe walked home alone from her night shift at the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. She quickened her pace, and soon, she heard footsteps echoing hers. Heart racing, she turned around to see a figure in a hospital gown with bloodshot eyes and a gaping wound on their chest. Frozen with fear, she realized too late that she had just let death catch up with her. After moving into their new house, the family noticed strange things happening around them. Objects would move on their own, and doors would creak open in the middle of the night. They brushed it off as the wind until they found a hidden room in the basement, filled with eerie objects and old newspapers reporting a series of unsolved murders that took place in the house years ago. As they tried to leave, the door slammed shut, trapping them inside with the vengeful ghosts of the victims. As the sun set behind the old abandoned house, a chill ran down Thomas' spine. He had heard rumors about the house being haunted, but he didn't believe them. He walked closer to the house and saw movement in one of the windows. As he turned to run, he heard a voice whisper, "Don't leave me here."